48 kilometers. On any other road, in any other month, a man could walk it before dark. A truck could cover it in under an hour. 48 kilometers is nothing. But on the Russian steppe in December 1942, distance stops being geography. It becomes something else entirely. It becomes fuel. It becomes ammunition. It becomes the number of frozen transmissions that will seize before morning. 48 kilometers. That was the gap. The space between the forward observers of the 57th Panzer Corps and the signal flares rising on the horizon. Pale, guttering lights fired by men who had been surrounded for weeks. 300,000 of them. The 6th Army, trapped inside Stalingrad, burning furniture for warmth, splitting rations 4 ways. The relief column could see those flares at night. They never closed the distance. And the reason they never closed it had nothing to do with Stalingrad itself. It had nothing to do with the fighting inside the city, or the rubble, or the frozen Volga. The reason began 200 kilometers to the northwest, along a quiet stretch of the Middle Dawn, where the 8th Italian Army held a section of front it was never equipped to hold. On December 16, 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Little Saturn. They hit the Italians with massed armor, deep penetration columns, and the full weight of a winter offensive designed not to take ground, but to tear open a wound so wide that no surgeon could close it. The Italians collapsed in 48 hours. Not because they lacked courage, because they lacked anti-tank guns, because they lacked motorized reserves, because they had been placed in the path of a storm with nothing but rifles and the assumption that the Soviets would attack somewhere else. That collapse killed Wintergewitter, the last operation that could have saved the 6th Army. This is the story of the front that broke first. December 12, 1942. The 57th Panzer Corps crosses its line of departure south of the Don, pushing northeast toward Stalingrad. General Friedrich Kirchner commands the spearhead. His strongest formation is the 6th Panzer Division, fresh from France, over 80% of its authorized strength, equipped with Panzer IV Ausf G tanks carrying the long 75mm gun. For the first hours, the attack catches the Soviets off guard. The advance is rapid. Ground falls away beneath the tracks. Snow kicks up in white curtains behind the columns, and the cold is a living thing, cracking engine blocks, splitting lips, turning exposed skin the color of tallow. But speed on the steppe is deceptive. Between the 57th Panzer Corps and the 6th Army sit 2 rivers, the Oksai, the Mishkova, each one a frozen obstacle, not frozen enough to bear the weight of a Panzer IV, not open enough to bridge easily. Each one a place where Soviet defenders can dig in, pre-register their artillery, and wait. By December 13th, resistance stiffens. Soviet anti-tank positions appear along the ridge lines. The fighting around Verkhneykumsky turns ugly. Tanks burning in the snow, black smoke columns visible for kilometers. The 6th Panzer Division pushes through, crosses the Oksai, reaches the Mishkova. But the timetable is already bleeding. Manstein had been promised 4 Panzer divisions for this operation. He received fewer. The forces he has are not enough to sustain a corridor once open. They are barely enough to maintain the point of the spear. And 400 kilometers to the rear, inside the pocket, the 6th Army has fuel for 30 kilometers of total movement. Not 30 kilometers per vehicle, 30 kilometers total. Even if the corridor opens, Paulus cannot drive his army through it. The math does not work. It has not worked since November. Strip away the drama. Strip away the flares on the horizon and the frozen rivers and the burning tanks. Look at the numbers. Wintergewitter did not fail because of a single bad decision. It failed because the system that was supposed to sustain the 6th Army had already collapsed before the 1st Panzer rolled south. The architecture of failure was built in layers. Layer 1. Göring's promise. 500 tons of supplies per day by air. Hitler accepted this as an operational planning basis. Not a hope, not an aspiration, but the foundation on which every subsequent decision rested. Hold Stalingrad. Do not break out. Relief will come. The airlift will sustain you until then. The best day of the airlift delivered roughly 150 tons. Most days, far less. The gap between promise and reality was not a miscalculation. It was the floor giving way beneath the entire decision tree. Layer 2. The flanks. Manstein raised this vulnerability in every situation report. The front line of Army Group Don was not held by German formations alone. Long stretches were covered by Allied armies, Romanian, Italian, Hungarian, units that had already proven unable to withstand a Soviet armored breakthrough. In November, Operation Uranus had struck the seam between German and Romanian forces. The Romanian line dissolved in hours. 300,000 men were encircled as a direct result. The same structural error, Allied forces in critical positions without adequate anti-tank weapons, without motorized reserves, remained uncorrected in December. It was not a failure of individual soldiers. Romanian troops, Italian troops, they fought with what they had. But what they had was not enough for this kind of war. Manstein knew it. He wrote it down. He sent it up the chain. The arithmetic of war had fixed the outcome in November, long before the first tank rolled. December 16th, 1942. 200 kilometers northwest of the 57th Panzer Corps, the sky splits open. Soviet artillery begins at dawn along the Middle Don. The barrage rolls across the positions of the 8th Italian Army, positions dug into frozen earth with hand tools, positions without concrete, without sufficient wire, without the anti-tank screens that might slow what comes next. What comes next is armor, columns of it. T-34s in echelon, grinding through the snow with infantry riding on their engine decks for warmth, their boots black with oil. Behind them, more armor. Behind that, motorized rifle brigades tasked with exploitation, not to fight the Italians, but to pour through whatever gap the tanks tear open and drive deep. The Italians fire. They hold in places. Individual positions resist with machine guns and grenades and a kind of desperate fury that has nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the fact that there is nowhere to run. But anti-tank rifles do not stop T-34s. Courage does not stop T-34s. By the end of the first day, the line is fractured. By the end of the second day, it is gone. 48 hours. The 8th Italian Army ceases to exist as a coherent fighting force. And through the hole it leaves behind, Soviet armored columns fan out in 3 directions. West toward the rail junction at Morozovsk, southwest toward the airfield supporting the Stalingrad airlift, and south toward Rostov. Rostov, the bottleneck, the single supply line connecting Army Group A in the Caucasus to the rest of the German front. If Rostov falls, it is not one army that dies. It is 2. The news reaches Manstein's headquarters the same day. In a single day, the entire strategic assessment changes. The collapse of the 8th Italian Army was not an anomaly. It was a repetition. November 1942. Operation Uranus strikes the Romanian flanks. The line dissolves. The 6th Army is encircled. December 1942. Operation Little Saturn strikes the Italian front. The line dissolves. The relief corridor dies. Same structural failure, same cause, same result. 1 month apart. The German command placed Allied armies in positions that required capabilities those armies did not possess. Not because the soldiers were inferior, because the armies were not equipped for this war. They lacked anti-tank guns capable of penetrating Soviet armor. They lacked motorized reserves capable of counterattacking a breakthrough. They lacked the logistical depth to absorb a blow and recover. This was not a secret. Manstein identified the flank vulnerability in every situation report he filed. He understood that his operational freedom depended on forces he could not trust to hold under pressure, not because of character, but because of equipment, training, and doctrine. The question that matters is not why the Italians broke. The question is why they were there at all. Why, after the Romanian collapse proved the concept fatally flawed, the same architecture was left standing on the Middle Don like a wall built from paper and asked to hold back a river. The answer is simple and unsatisfying. There was no one else. Germany did not have the divisions to cover every kilometer of front. The Allied armies filled gaps that German forces could not fill. And so the command accepted a known risk, documented it carefully, and hoped the Soviets would not exploit it again. The Soviets exploited it again. This is where the two timelines collide. On December 18th, the 57th Panzer Corps is still fighting forward. The Mishkova crossing is contested. Tanks burn on both banks. German engineers work under fire, their hands too numb to grip wrenches, breath freezing on their collars. 48 kilometers to the pocket. The flares are visible. The 6th Army is right there. And behind them, behind the entire relief force, the ground is opening up. The Italian collapse has torn a gap so wide that Soviet armor is now operating in the German rear. Not probing, not raiding, operating. Armored columns driving toward Morozovsk, toward the airfields, toward Rostov. The threat is no longer to the flank of the relief operation. The threat is to the existence of Army Group A, a force larger than the 6th Army, spread across the Caucasus, dependent on a single road through a single city. Manstein faces a choice that is not really a choice. He can continue north toward Stalingrad with forces insufficient for the task, while Soviet armor cuts his supply lines and threatens a catastrophe that would dwarf the encirclement of the 6th Army. Or he can pull the 57th Panzer Corps back, redirect it west, and try to seal the breach before Rostov falls. He cannot do both. His forces are not enough for one of these missions. They are certainly not enough for two. 48 kilometers, close enough to see the flares, close enough to hear the guns on quiet nights if the wind is right. Not close enough. It was never going to be close enough. December 23, 1942. Manstein cancels the attack. He does not wait for Hitler's permission. Hitler, in his headquarters 1,000 kilometers away, still insists on relief, still demands the 6th Army hold, still believes in the airlift, in the corridor, in the promise that was broken before it was made. Manstein withdraws the 57th Panzer Corps, not on orders, on judgment. The tanks turn around. The columns that had pushed northeast for 11 days now reverse course, grinding back through the same frozen ground they had fought to take. The same villages, the same crossroads, the same dead still lying where they fell, now covered in fresh snow. On the night of December 24th, Christmas Eve, the 4th Panzer Army begins its full withdrawal from the relief axis. Inside the pocket, the 6th Army receives no order to break out. No corridor opens, no fuel arrives. The flares they fire into the night sky go unanswered. The horizon to the south, where the relief column had been visible as a distant glow of burning vehicles and muzzle flashes, goes dark. 300,000 men, surrounded. The airlift delivering a fraction of what was promised. Ammunition rationed. Rations halved, then halved again. Horses slaughtered for meat. Frostbite taking fingers, toes, noses. The flesh turning black and hard like wood. No one tells them it is over. Not yet. The radio traffic continues. Orders still arrive. Hold your positions. Relief is being reorganized. Hold. But the men on the perimeter know. They knew before the generals said it. They knew when the horizon went quiet, when the sound of German guns to the south stopped carrying on the wind. Silence is its own communique. The loss of Rostov would have cut off Army Group A in the Caucasus entirely. Every supply line, every reinforcement route, every path of retreat ran through that single city. The force in the Caucasus was larger than the Sixth Army. Its destruction would have been a catastrophe exceeding Stalingrad in pure scale. This is why Manstein turned back. Not because he gave up on the Sixth Army, because the alternative was losing two armies instead of one. The arithmetic was brutal, and it was clear. Wintergewitter's death was not a failure of will. It was a collision between what was desired and what was possible. The Italian collapse did not cause Stalingrad. Stalingrad was already a disaster by the time the first Soviet shell landed on the Middle Don. The encirclement was complete. The airlift was failing. The Sixth Army had fuel for 30 kilometers, not enough to reach the relief column even if the corridor opened. But the Italian collapse killed the last chance. It eliminated the final, narrow, improbable window in which something might have been salvaged. It forced the choice between a rescue that was already failing and a catastrophe that was still preventable. Manstein chose to prevent the larger catastrophe. He pulled the spearhead back. He redirected forces west, and in doing so, he sealed the fate of 300,000 men who were already, in every way that mattered, beyond rescue. The Sixth Army surrendered on February 2nd, 1943. The decision had been made 6 weeks earlier. On a quiet stretch of the Middle Dawn in 48 hours. 48 kilometers. The observers of the 57th Panzer Corps saw those flares, pale lights rising over the steppe, fired by men who did not know they had already been abandoned by the mathematics of the war itself. The distance was never geographical. It was structural, built from missing anti-tank guns on the Italian front, built from 500 tons of supplies that never arrived, built from fuel gauges reading empty inside the pocket. Built from a repeated error, the same weak seam struck twice in 30 days, breaking the same way both times. No single decision doomed Stalingrad. A cascade did. Goering's promise laid the foundation. The refusal to break out closed the window. The Italian collapse locked the door. And Manstein, standing before that locked door with insufficient forces and an impossible choice, did the only thing the numbers permitted. He turned around. The flares kept rising over Stalingrad for weeks after that. Fewer each night, dimmer. Then they stopped.